He never drew an actual map, but the boundaries Lucky Luciano established in 1931 still shape how organized crime operates in New York nearly a century later. New York City covers roughly 300 square miles, 5 boroughs, 8 million people, and an almost incomprehensible density of streets, neighborhoods, and territories. When Lucky Luciano created the commission in 1931, one of its first and most consequential achievements was a written law or a formal treaty. It was something more fundamental, an agreement about space, about which family controlled which neighborhoods, which streets, which specific blocks where specific businesses operated. An invisible map that existed nowhere on paper, but that everyone in organized crime understood and largely respected for decades. That map didn't just organize criminal enterprise in 1931. In modified, evolved, but recognizably continuous form, it influenced how organized crime functioned in New York for the rest of the 20th century, and, according to law enforcement officials who track these things, echoes that remain detectable even now in territories and patterns that trace directly back to decisions made nearly 100 years ago. This is a story of how Lucky Luciano transformed New York City into a divided criminal landscape, and why those divisions proved so much more durable than anyone could have predicted. But the real story was never only about geography. To understand why territorial division mattered so much, you need to understand the chaos that preceded it. Before the Commission, New York's Italian-American organized crime existed, in a state of constant low-level conflict over exactly these questions. Whose neighborhood was whose? Whose protection rackets covered which businesses? Whose bootlegging operations could distribute in which areas without triggering violent confrontation with a rival crew? The Castellammarese War that had just concluded was, at its core, partly a conflict about exactly these territorial questions, dressed up in larger ideological disputes about leadership and structure, but ultimately rooted in the same basic problem. Too many ambitious criminals competing for the same physical space. Luciano understood that creating the Commission's governance structure meant nothing if it didn't address this fundamental spatial problem. You could create all the rules you wanted about dispute resolution and profit sharing, but if two families both believed they had legitimate claims to the same 6 blocks of Brooklyn, conflict was inevitable regardless of what formal Commission rules said about preferring negotiation to violence. So alongside the organizational structure of the Commission, Luciano and the other founding bosses worked out something almost as important, a geographic settlement. Each of the 5 families that emerged from the post-Castellammarese reorganization received recognized primary territories, areas where their authority over criminal enterprise wouldn't be challenged by other families, with a basic economic infrastructure of organized crime, gambling operations, loan sharking, labor racketeering. Eventually, narcotics distribution could operate without triggering destructive turf wars. What happened next changed the meaning of everything that came before. The territorial division that emerged wasn't drawn with the precision of municipal zoning maps, but it followed recognizable patterns rooted in immigration history, existing criminal infrastructure, and the practical realities of which families already had functioning operations in which neighborhoods before the formal commission structure was established. The family that would eventually become known as the Gambino family, though in 1931 it was led by Vincent Mangano, claimed primary territory across significant portions of Brooklyn and Queens. This wasn't arbitrary. Brooklyn's docks, its dense Italian immigrant neighborhoods in areas like Bensonhurst and Bath Beach, its growing connections to Queens' expanding development, all provided natural infrastructure for organized crime operations that the Mangano organization had been building for years before formal commission recognition made it official. The family that would become the Genovese family, with Luciano himself as its founding boss, claimed primary territory across much of Manhattan, particularly Greenwich Village and the Lower East Side, the neighborhoods Luciano had grown up in, where his earliest criminal connections and infrastructure already existed. This wasn't coincidental. The neighborhoods where Luciano had spent his childhood, where he'd learned the streets as a young immigrant, where he'd built his first criminal relationships, became the territorial core of the most powerful family in the new commission structure. The Lucchese family, originally led by Gaetano Tommy Gagliano, established primary influence in the Garment District and certain Brooklyn neighborhoods, building on existing labor racketeering operations that connected to New York's massive textile and clothing manufacturing industry. The Bonanno family, led by Joseph Bonanno, claimed territory spanning parts of Brooklyn and the Bronx. The Colombo family, in its earliest iteration, established presence in Brooklyn neighborhoods and Long Island, areas that would prove increasingly important as New York's population and economic activity expanded outward from Manhattan in subsequent decades. The confidence in their presence did not mean certainty existed within them. What's important to understand about this territorial division is that it wasn't simply about claiming neighborhoods for bragging rights. Each territory came with specific economic infrastructure that the controlling family could exploit relatively free from interference. Gambling operations required physical locations, backrooms, social clubs, specific buildings where dice games and card games could operate with the tacit protection that came from operating in territory the controlling family, and secured through corruption of local police and political officials. Loan sharking required knowledge of local businesses and individuals who might need quick capital outside legitimate banking channels, knowledge that came from deep neighborhood roots and ongoing presence rather than occasional visits from outside territory. Labor racketeering required control over specific unions and the businesses that depended on those unions' cooperation, connections that took years to build and that depended on consistent presence within specific industries concentrated in specific geographic areas. This meant the territorial agreements weren't just about avoiding violence. They were about creating conditions for each family to develop deep, sustainable economic infrastructure within bounded areas, infrastructure that became increasingly difficult to challenge precisely because it had years to embed itself into legitimate economic and political structures of those neighborhoods. But there was something no one around them could fully understand: the genius of this territorial system, and what made it more durable than anyone initially expected was how it created self-reinforcing local power structures. A family that controlled gambling and loan sharking in a specific Brooklyn neighborhood for a decade developed relationships with local business owners, local police precincts, local political clubs, and local residents that became almost impossible for an outside family to replicate quickly. The territory wasn't just claimed through commission agreement. It was earned and continuously reinforced through ongoing presence, ongoing corruption relationships, and ongoing community embeddedness that took years to build and that provided natural resistance against incursion. This explains why, even decades after the original 1931 agreements, law enforcement officials and organized crime researchers continue to identify recognizable territorial patterns that trace back to those founding decisions. The Gambino family maintained strong connections to specific Brooklyn and Queens neighborhoods well into the late 20th century. The Genovese family's Manhattan influence, particularly in Greenwich Village and certain Lower East Side areas, persisted for generations. These weren't coincidences or simple historical curiosities. They were the predictable result of how deeply embedded criminal infrastructure becomes within specific communities over extended periods. He built a world that looked controlled, even while carrying burdens no one could see. The territorial system also created a particular kind of stability that benefited everyone within the commission structure, even as it created challenges for law enforcement trying to understand and dismantle organized crime. When each family had recognized primary territory, the incentive for destructive turf wars diminished significantly. Why risk violent conflict trying to expand into another family's established territory when your own territory provided sufficient economic opportunity, and when commission rules provided mechanisms for addressing disputes that arose at territorial boundaries? This isn't to suggest the system eliminated all territorial conflict. Disputes still arose, particularly as New York's economic geography shifted over decades, as some neighborhoods declined economically while others experienced new development, as new criminal opportunities emerged in areas that hadn't been significant when the original territorial agreements were established, as families experienced internal leadership changes that sometimes led to more aggressive territorial ambitions than previous leadership had pursued. But the basic framework, 5 families, 5 primary territories, a commission structure for adjudicating disputes that arose at the boundaries, provided enough stability that organized crime in New York avoided the kind of constant, destructive warfare that had characterized the pre-commission era. This stability, ironically, made these criminal organizations more resilient and harder for law enforcement to dismantle precisely because they weren't constantly weakening themselves through internal warfare the way less organized criminal enterprises typically did. What people called legendary often began as something deeply personal. The territorial system also reveals something important about how Luciano understood power that distinguished him from predecessors like Maranzano. Where Maranzano had imagined a structure with absolute centralized authority, essentially demanding that all decisions, including territorial questions, flow through his personal judgment as boss of bosses, Luciano's commission approach distributed not just decision-making authority, but physical control over specific geographic and economic resources. Each family boss had genuine autonomous authority within recognized boundaries, rather than merely administering territory at the pleasure of supreme authority, who could reassign or revoke that control at will. This distinction mattered enormously for the system's long-term durability. A territorial arrangement dependent on Luciano's personal ongoing authority would have been vulnerable to exactly the kind of collapse that destroyed Maranzano's empire the moment its central authority figure was removed. But because Luciano's system granted genuine autonomous territorial authority to each family, the structure survived his imprisonment, his deportation, and eventually his death, because no single point of failure could collapse the entire system. The image was real, so was the silence afterward. Understanding this geographic dimension of Luciano's organizational genius helps explain something that often confuses people studying organized crime history: why the five-family structure proved so remarkably durable compared to criminal organizations in other cities that lack similarly clear territorial agreements. Chicago's organized crime, for instance, experienced more sustained internal conflict partly because it never developed the same kind of clear, mutually respected territorial boundaries that characterized New York's post-1931 settlement. The specific neighborhoods associated with each family also reveals something about the deeper social history of New York's immigrant communities and how organized crime embedded itself within broader patterns of ethnic settlement, economic development, and political organization. The territories weren't arbitrary criminal claims. They reflected and reinforced existing patterns of Italian-American community life, creating criminal infrastructure that operated alongside and sometimes indistinguishably from legitimate community institutions, social clubs, and political organizations. This embeddedness explains why law enforcement efforts to dismantle organized crime, even when individual leaders were successfully prosecuted, often struggled to eliminate organizational presence within specific territories. You could convict a boss, but the underlying community relationships, the corrupted political connections, the economic infrastructure built over decades within specific neighborhoods, these proved far more resistant to elimination than any individual leader's removal could achieve. Many knew the legend of the Commission as an organizational and governance achievement. Far fewer fully appreciated the territorial dimension that made that governance structure practically functional rather than merely theoretical. Luciano didn't just create rules for how families should interact. He helped establish the physical, geographic foundation that gave those rules practical meaning and durability. That spatial intelligence came from somewhere much deeper than simple criminal calculation. Luciano had grown up navigating New York's complex ethnic and territorial geography as an immigrant child, learning from direct experience how neighborhood boundaries shaped opportunity, protection, and danger. He understood, in ways that more abstractly intellectual figures like Maranzano perhaps didn't, that organizational structures meant nothing without corresponding physical, geographic reality to anchor them. The real story was never only about which family controlled which specific streets in 1931. It was about how thoroughly Luciano understood that lasting power requires both organizational structure and physical, territorial foundation, that abstract governance principles needed concrete geographic anchoring to translate into durable, functional reality. The Commission provided the rules. The territorial agreements provided the ground those rules could actually stand on. When modern law enforcement officials, true crime researchers, or curious New Yorkers trace the historical patterns of organized crime activity across the five boroughs, they're not just observing interesting historical trivia. They're observing the lasting physical legacy of decisions made in 1931, decisions that proved durable precisely because Luciano understood something his predecessors and many of his contemporaries missed: that criminal empires, like all empires, ultimately exist in physical space, and that lasting power requires not just clever rules but genuine, defensible, mutually respected territorial foundation. Lucky Luciano never drew an official map of New York City, divided into 5 criminal territories. He didn't need to. The map existed in the accumulated decisions, relationships, and economic infrastructure that each family built within their recognized boundaries over decades of largely respected territorial agreement. That invisible map proved more durable than almost anything else Luciano created, because it was embedded not in written rules that could be challenged or reinterpreted, but in the physical, economic, and social reality of New York City itself. The boundaries he helped establish in 1931 didn't just organize criminal enterprise for a few years or even a few decades. They created patterns that researchers, law enforcement, and historians continue to trace in the underlying structure of how organized crime has operated across New York's 5 boroughs for nearly a century. Proof that the most durable power structures aren't necessarily the ones with the most explicit rules, but the ones most deeply embedded in physical, geographic, and economic reality.